My name is Joaquin Vasquez. I was a 911 dispatcher for 12 years in Dallas, Texas. On October 17, 2023, I thought I was coordinating emergency responses during my overnight shift. Instead, I witnessed the first night of the zombie outbreak that would destroy everything. In less than 8 hours, I watched my city fall, my colleagues die, and civilization collapse through radio calls and security footage. I survived by abandoning my post, leaving people behind and using every trick I learned as a dispatcher to escape Dallas before the military bombed it. This is exactly what happened during those first terrifying hours. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I need to tell you something that's been eating at me for months now. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about how quickly our world could fall apart. I'm Joaquin Vasquez, and for 12 years, I worked as a senior dispatcher at the Dallas Emergency Operations Center. I thought I'd seen everything in those 12 years. Drug overdoses, domestic violence calls that would make your stomach turn, car accidents that left families destroyed. I used to joke with my colleagues that nothing could surprise me anymore. I was wrong, dead wrong. October 17th, 2023. That date is burned into my memory like a brand. It was a Tuesday night, and I was starting my usual 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. The Dallas Emergency Operations Center sits downtown, and from my workstation I could coordinate police, fire, and medical responses across the entire Dallas County area. That's over 2.5 million people depending on dispatchers like me to send help when their world was falling apart. I took that responsibility seriously. Maybe too seriously. When I walked into the operations center that night, something felt different. I can't explain it exactly, but the air felt heavy, charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm when the hair on your arm stands up. My supervisor, Mike Chen, was supposed to get off at 10, but he was still there, hunched, over his console with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Mike had been doing this job for 15 years. He was the guy who trained me when I first started, and I'd never seen him look so tired. Sarah Martinez was working her third week as a dispatcher. She was 24 years old, fresh out of the emergency services training program, and still had that eager look in her eyes like she was going to save the world one call at a time. I remembered having that same look once. The job has a way of wearing it out of you. But Sarah still had it. She was working the overnight shift to get experience with the more challenging calls that came in during the dark hours. The first thing I noticed when I sat down at my workstation was how quiet it was. Tuesday nights in Dallas were usually steady. Not crazy busy like Friday or Saturday nights, but steady. Domestic disputes, traffic accidents, the occasional break in. But that night felt different. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes experienced dispatchers nervous because we know it never lasts. I logged into my system and started reviewing the day shift reports. That's when I first noticed something that should have been a red flag. Over the past week, there had been an unusual increase in what we categorized as erratic behavior calls. People acting aggressively for no apparent reason, attacking strangers, biting incidents. The reports were scattered across different neighborhoods, different times of day. But when I looked at them all together, there was definitely a pattern forming. Mike noticed me going through the reports and walked over to my station. He looked exhausted more than usual, and there were dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't been sleeping well. He told me the day shift had been dealing with weird calls all week. People calling about neighbors acting strangely, reports of individuals who seemed sick but were being violent instead of seeking medical help. The kind of calls that made everyone uncomfortable because they didn't fit the normal categories we were trained to handle. What really caught my attention was that several of these incidents had occurred near major food distribution centers. Warehouses, processing plants, grocery store loading docks. At the time, I thought it might be related to the food contamination warnings that had been on the news. There had been reports about potentially tainted meat products from some overseas supplier, but the health department and the CDC had downplayed the severity. They said it was just precautionary recalls, nothing to worry about. Sarah was handling most of the calls that first hour, and I could tell she was getting frustrated. She kept getting calls about loud noises, disturbances, people acting strangely, But when officers arrived at the scenes, they found nothing conclusive. Neighbors would call saying someone was screaming or making inhuman sounds, but by the time patrol units got there, everything would be quiet. It was the kind of pattern that made dispatch work maddening. Always one step behind whatever was actually happening. Around 11:30, we got our first call that really stood out. A gas station attendant on Interstate 35 called about a customer who was acting aggressively. The caller, a young man named David, said the customer had come into the store looking sick. Pale skin, glassy eyes, moving strangely. When David asked if he needed help, the customer had lunged at him across the counter. David managed to get away and lock himself in the back office, but he said the customer was still in the store, just standing there, swaying back and forth. I dispatched Unit 23 to respond, Officers Johnson and Patricia Williams. They were good cops, experienced, level-headed, the kind of officers you want handling the weird calls because they don't panic and they file thorough reports. Johnson radioed back about 20 minutes later saying they'd found the store empty except for the attendant. No sign of the aggressive customer, but they noted that there was a strong smell in the store. Something rotten like spoiled meat. They took a statement from David and cleared the scene. That should have been the end of it, but 20 minutes after Johnson and Williams left, we got another call. This one from a convenience store about 15 miles away. Different caller, same story. Sick-looking customer acting aggressively, trying to attack the clerk. By the time Officer Rodriguez arrived at that scene, the customer was gone, but again there was that smell. Rotten meat, spoiled food, something dead. I started to pay closer attention to the locations of these calls. When I mapped them out on my computer, they formed a rough circle around the eastern part of Dallas County, all within about a 20-mile radius of the major food processing facility that had been mentioned in the contamination warnings. The facility that distributed meat products to grocery stores, restaurants, and cafeterias throughout the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Sarah was starting to look nervous. She'd been taking calls all night about people acting strangely, and the descriptions were getting more disturbing. Callers reporting family members who seemed sick but were being violent, neighbors making inhuman sounds, people who appeared to be in pain but wouldn't accept help. She kept looking over at me and Mike like she was hoping we'd explain what was happening. Mike had pulled up the same reports I was looking at, and I could see him connecting the same dots. He'd been in this job long enough to recognize when individual incidents were part of something bigger. He called the health department emergency line to report the pattern we were seeing, but they told him they were aware of some isolated food poisoning cases and that it was being handled through normal channels. Nothing to worry about. Just follow standard protocols. The radio chatter was starting to concern me too. Officers were reporting strange smells at multiple locations. Calls about people who seemed to be sick but were being aggressive instead of seeking medical attention. There were reports of individuals who didn't respond normally to police commands. People who seemed to be in their own world, not aware of their surroundings, but still moving and acting in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. Around 1 in the morning, I got a call that made my blood run cold. An elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, no relation to my supervisor Mike, called from a nursing home in East Dallas. She was whispering into the phone, clearly terrified. She said several of the residents had become violent during dinner time. They'd been served a special meal earlier in the evening, something with meat that had been donated by a local supplier. Within a few hours, 6 of the residents had started acting aggressively. They were attacking other residents and staff members, biting them. The facility had locked down, but Mrs. Chen was hiding in a supply closet because she could hear screaming in the hallways. I immediately dispatched multiple units to the nursing home, along with paramedics and fire department personnel. But something about that call stayed with me. The timing, the donated meat, the aggressive behavior that started after eating. It was too much of a coincidence to ignore. By 2 in the morning, we'd handled 17 calls about erratic behavior, aggressive individuals, or people who seemed sick but were being violent. All of them in the same general area of Dallas County. All of them somehow connected to locations that had received food from the same distribution network. I tried calling the health department again, But they told me they were monitoring the situation and that local emergency services should continue, following standard protocols. That's when I realized we weren't just dealing with isolated incidents anymore. This was something bigger, something that was spreading. The calls were coming in faster, the descriptions were getting worse, and the pattern was expanding outward from that central distribution area like ripples in a pond. Sarah was clearly overwhelmed. She'd never dealt with anything like this before, and the calls were starting to affect her. People screaming into the phone about family members who were acting like animals, callers who were hiding from people they'd known their whole lives because those people were trying to hurt them. Mike had taken over several of her calls, but I could see the strain on his face too. The most disturbing part was the radio communication from our officers in the field. They were reporting scenes that didn't make sense. People who seemed to be seriously injured but were still moving around and being aggressive. Individuals who didn't respond to verbal commands, taser deployment, or even physical restraint techniques. Officers requesting backup for situations they couldn't explain in standard police terminology. Officer Martinez radioed in around 2:15 with a report that made everyone in the operations center stop and listen. He'd responded to a domestic disturbance call, but when he arrived, he found the front door of the house standing open. Inside, there were signs of a struggle, blood on the walls and furniture, but no people. The neighbors who'd called said they'd heard screaming for about 20 minutes, then everything went quiet. Martinez was requesting crime scene technicians and detectives, but he also requested additional patrol units because he said something about the scene didn't feel right. I was starting to put together a picture that I didn't want to believe. Food contamination leading to some kind of illness that made people violent and aggressive, an illness that was spreading throughout the Dallas area faster than anyone realized. The health department either didn't understand what was happening, or they were downplaying it for reasons I couldn't figure out. The radio traffic was getting heavier. More officers requesting backup, more calls about people acting aggressively, more reports of strange smells, unusual behavior, and situations that didn't fit normal emergency response categories. I could hear the confusion in the officers' voices. These were experienced cops, people who dealt with everything from drug-induced psychosis to severe mental health crises, but they were encountering something they'd never seen before. Around 2:30, we got a call that changed everything. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman from Oak Cliff, called 911 in absolute hysteria. She was screaming into the phone about her neighbor attacking her dog in the backyard. But it wasn't just attacking the dog. According to Mrs. Henderson, her neighbor was eating the dog, tearing into it with his teeth while the animal was still alive. I tried to calm Mrs. Henderson down and get more details, but she was barely coherent. She kept saying her neighbor looked wrong. His skin was gray, his eyes were white, and he smelled like something that had been dead for days. When she'd yelled at him to stop, he'd looked up at her with blood covering his face and made a sound she described as inhuman. Not quite a growl, not quite a scream, but something that made every instinct in her body tell her to run. I dispatched Unit 47 to Mrs. Henderson's address, Officers Thompson and Garcia. They were both veteran officers with over 10 years of experience, each. The kind of cops who'd seen everything and stayed calm under pressure. Mrs. Henderson stayed on the line with me while we waited for them to arrive, and I could hear her moving around her house, checking locks, closing curtains. She was terrified in a way that went beyond normal fear. This was primal terror, the kind that comes from seeing something that shouldn't exist. When Thompson and Garcia arrived at the scene, they found Mrs. Henderson's backyard exactly as she'd described. The remains of the dog were scattered across the grass, but there was no sign of the neighbor. They did a perimeter check and found the neighbor's back door standing open, but the house appeared to be empty. Garcia radioed that there was a strong odor of decay coming from inside the house, but they couldn't locate anyone to question or arrest. That's when I knew we were dealing with something that went beyond normal police work. Mrs. Henderson wasn't some confused elderly woman making up stories. She'd witnessed something real, something terrible, and whatever had happened to her neighbor was connected to all the other strange calls we'd been receiving. I looked at the clock on my workstation. It was 2:47 in the morning. In Less than 5 hours, my shift would be over and I'd go home to my apartment, make some breakfast, and try to get some sleep before coming back the next night. That's what I thought would happen. I had no idea that Mrs. Henderson's call about her neighbor was the first confirmed report of what would later be called a zombie attack. I had no idea that in the next few hours I would watch Dallas fall apart completely. The minutes after Mrs. Henderson's call felt different. There was a tension in the operations center that I'd never experienced before. Sarah was staring at her console like she was afraid it might ring again, and Mike had gone completely silent, just monitoring the radio chatter from Thompson and Garcia as they searched the neighbor's empty house. I was trying to process what Mrs. Henderson had described, but my brain kept rejecting it. People don't eat dogs alive. People don't have gray skin and white eyes and make inhuman sounds. But I'd been a dispatcher long enough to know when someone was telling the truth, and Mrs. Henderson had been telling the truth. At 3:15 in the morning, everything started happening at once. My console lit up with incoming calls. Sarah's phone started ringing and the radio exploded with chatter from multiple units requesting immediate backup. The flood had begun, and we were about to be swept away by it. The first call I took was from a security guard at the Walmart in Mesquite. His name was Marcus, and he was barely able to speak through his panic. He told me there were multiple people attacking customers in the store. Not robbing them, not fighting with them, but actually attacking them with their teeth and hands. He said he'd watched a woman in the produce section grab an elderly man and bite into his neck like she was trying to tear his throat out. When other customers tried to help, she turned on them too. Marcus was locked in the security office watching everything unfold on the surveillance monitors. He counted at least 8 people who were attacking others. But what made his voice shake when he talked to me was that some of the victims were getting back up. People who had been severely injured, people who should have been unconscious or worse, were standing up and joining the attackers. He kept saying it didn't make sense, that people don't behave that way, that something was very wrong with everyone in his store. I dispatched every available unit to the Walmart, which was 6 patrol cars and 2 ambulances. At the same time, Sarah was taking a call from an apartment complex in Deep Ellum. The caller was a young mother named Jennifer, who was barricaded in her apartment with her 2 children. She said people in the hallways were attacking each other, going door to door trying to break into apartments. She could hear screaming and pounding on doors throughout the building. When I asked her to describe what she was seeing, she told me the attackers all looked sick. Their skin was pale and gray, their eyes were cloudy, and they moved in a jerky, unnatural way that made her children cry just from watching through the peephole. Mike had taken over the radio coordination and was trying to direct our response to multiple active incidents simultaneously. This was the kind of situation we trained for, mass casualty events where multiple locations needed immediate response. But something about this felt different. The radio chatter from our officers wasn't following normal patterns. They were using words like impossible and unnatural, and requesting backup in voices that sounded genuinely frightened. Officer Rodriguez was first to arrive at the Walmart, and his initial radio report made everyone in the operations center stop what they were doing to listen. He said the parking lot was full of people running and screaming, but there were others who were walking through the chaos completely calm. These calm ones were covered in blood, moving with that same jerky gait that Jennifer had described, and they were pursuing the running people with single-minded determination. Rodriguez requested immediate backup from every available unit and asked for the fire department to respond as well. The security guard Marcus stayed on the line with me while Rodriguez and his partner entered the store. Through the phone, I could hear Marcus watching the security monitors and describing what he saw. The attackers inside the store had cornered a group of customers near the pharmacy. They were tearing into them with their hands and teeth, but what made Marcus's voice break was that the people being attacked weren't just dying. They were getting back up after a few minutes and joining the group of attackers. He kept saying he was watching people die and come back to life, and he knew how crazy that sounded, but he was seeing it happen over and over again. Sarah was coordinating response to the apartment complex in Deep Ellum, but the officers who arrived there were reporting similar scenes. People who appeared to be seriously injured, but were still moving and attacking others. Individuals who didn't respond to verbal commands or even physical intervention. Officer Williams radioed that she'd deployed her taser on a woman who was attacking a maintenance worker, but the woman hadn't even slowed down. The electrical charge that should have incapacitated her completely had no effect at all. By 3:30, we had 17 active incidents across Dallas County, all of them involving multiple attackers who fit the same description: gray skin, cloudy eyes, jerky movements, and complete immunity to pain or normal law enforcement techniques. All of them in areas that had received food deliveries from the same contaminated distribution network. The pattern was undeniable now, but acknowledging it meant accepting something that shouldn't be possible. The radio chatter was becoming increasingly frantic. Officers were requesting backup, medical support, and tactical teams, but they were also asking questions that we couldn't answer. How do you restrain someone who doesn't respond to tasers? How do you provide medical aid to people who are severely injured but still mobile and aggressive? How do you handle a situation where the victims become part of the problem? Officer Martinez radioed in from the 24-hour diner on Mockingbird Lane with a report that made my hands shake as I wrote it down. He'd responded to a call about multiple disturbances at the diner, but when he arrived, he found what he described as a massacre. The diner was full of people attacking each other, but they weren't using weapons. They were using their teeth and hands, tearing into each other like wild animals. Martinez said he'd never seen anything like it in 15 years of police work. What made Martinez's report especially disturbing was his description of the attackers' behavior. They moved as a group, like they were coordinated somehow. When new people entered the diner, all of the attackers would turn toward them simultaneously. They made sounds that Martinez said weren't quite human, guttural moans and growls that seemed to communicate with each other. And most importantly, they showed no fear of police presence. When Martinez identified himself as a police officer and ordered them to stop, they turned toward him with what he described as hunger in their eyes. Marcus, the security guard at the Walmart, was still on the line with me, and his reports were getting worse by the minute. He said the number of attackers inside the store had tripled in the past 15 minutes. Every person who was attacked and injured was getting back up after a few minutes and joining the group. The store was filling up with these infected people, and they were working together to hunt down the few remaining uninfected customers who were hiding throughout the building. The most chilling part of Marcus's report was when he described watching the security footage from different areas of the store. The attackers weren't random or chaotic. They were systematically searching every aisle, every hiding spot, every possible place where uninfected people might be concealed. They were problem-solving, working together and learning from each encounter. This wasn't mindless violence, it was organized hunting. Sarah was handling calls from all over Dallas County now, and every one of them was following the same pattern. Normal people suddenly becoming violent and attacking others. Victims who should have been incapacitated continuing to move and fight. Groups of attackers who seemed to coordinate their actions without speaking. And in every case, the attackers had that same appearance: gray skin, cloudy white eyes, and the smell of death that clung to them like a fog. Officer Rodriguez radioed from the Walmart with an urgent request for hazmat teams and medical personnel with infectious disease training. He said his partner had been bitten by one of the attackers, and within minutes of the bite, his partner started showing symptoms: fever, disorientation, and aggressive behavior toward Rodriguez himself. Rodriguez was requesting immediate medical evacuation for his partner, but he was also requesting permission to treat this as a potential biological hazard. That's when I realized we weren't just dealing with violent individuals anymore. We were dealing with some kind of infectious agent that was spreading through bites and physical contact. The contaminated food had been the initial vector, but now it was spreading person to person through the attacks themselves. Every incident was creating more infected individuals, and those individuals were creating even more incidents in an exponential pattern that was overwhelming our response capacity. Mike had pulled up the emergency protocols for biological hazards and infectious disease outbreaks, but none of them covered anything like what we were experiencing. The procedures assumed that infected individuals would seek medical attention, not attack other people. They assumed that quarantine measures could be implemented in cooperation with public health officials. not that infected individuals would actively resist containment efforts. The helicopter pilot who had been providing surveillance support for our ground units radioed in with a report that changed everything. From his aerial position, he could see the bigger picture that we couldn't see from the ground level. He said there were dozens of groups of infected people moving throughout Dallas County, all heading in the same general direction toward the city center. They weren't walking randomly. They were following specific routes, like they had a destination in mind. Even more disturbing was the pilot's report about the size of these groups. What had started as individual incidents with 1 or 2 attackers had grown into groups of 10, 15, or 20 infected people moving together. And these groups were growing larger as they encountered more uninfected individuals. The pilot estimated that there were already several hundred infected people on the streets of Dallas, and the number was increasing rapidly. Jennifer, the mother barricaded in her apartment in Deep Ellum, called back to report that the situation in her building had gotten worse. She could hear the infected people breaking down doors and attacking the residents inside. But what terrified her most was that she could hear children crying, and then the crying would stop, and a few minutes later she would hear those same children making the same inhuman sounds as the adult attackers. The infection was spreading to everyone, regardless of age, and it was spreading fast. Marcus at the Walmart gave me his final report. At 4 o'clock in the morning, he said the entire store was now overrun with infected people. He estimated there were at least 50 of them wandering through the aisles, and they had systematically hunted down every uninfected person in the building. But they weren't leaving. They were staying in the store, almost like they were waiting for something, or guarding something. The radio chatter from our officers in the field was becoming increasingly desperate. They were reporting that standard law enforcement techniques were completely ineffective against the infected. Tasers, pepper spray, physical restraints, even firearms weren't stopping the attackers. Officers were requesting permission to use lethal force, but even that wasn't working the way it should. The infected people were continuing to move and attack, even after sustaining injuries that should have been immediately incapacitating. Officer Williams radioed from the apartment complex in Deep Ellum with a report that made everyone in the operations center go silent. She said she'd been forced to shoot one of the attackers multiple times in the chest, but the attacker had continued advancing toward her until she'd shot him in the head. Only a headshot had actually stopped the attack. She was requesting immediate guidance from supervisors about rules of engagement because everything she'd been trained to do was useless against these infected people. Sarah was crying now, taking call after call from people who were trapped, hiding, begging for help that we couldn't provide fast enough. Every call was the same story: normal people suddenly becoming violent, attacking everyone around them, and spreading whatever infection was causing this behavior to everyone they encountered. The calls were coming from all over Dallas County now, spreading outward from those initial food distribution points like a wildfire that we couldn't contain. Mike was coordinating with federal emergency management agencies, but they were telling him to follow standard protocols for biological hazards. Establish quarantine zones, coordinate with public health officials, and wait for federal response teams to arrive. But the standard protocols assumed that infected individuals would cooperate with quarantine efforts, and these people were actively breaking out of any containment we tried to establish. At 4:30 in the morning, Officer Martinez radioed in with the transmission that I'll never forget. He was at the diner on Mockingbird Lane, and he'd been observing the infected people inside the building. He said there were at least 15 of them now, all with the same gray skin and white eyes that every other witness had described. But what made his voice shake when he spoke was that they were organizing themselves. They had positioned some of their group at the exits to prevent anyone from escaping, while others systematically searched the building for hiding people. Martinez said he was watching them coordinate their actions without speaking, like they could communicate through some method that he couldn't detect. When they found hiding people, they would signal to the others and the entire group would converge on that location. They were problem-solving, adapting their tactics and working together with a level of organization that shouldn't have been possible if this was just some kind of rabies-like infection. That's when Martinez reported seeing something that made my blood run cold. Among the group of infected people in the diner, he recognized 2 faces. They were police officers from the night shift, guys he'd worked with for years. They were wearing their uniforms, still had their equipment, but their skin had turned gray and their eyes had gone white. They were moving with that same jerky gait as all the other infected people, and they were participating in the hunt for uninfected individuals just like the rest of the group. Martinez was requesting immediate backup and guidance about how to handle infected police officers. Do you treat them as fellow officers who need medical assistance, or do you treat them as hostile individuals who are threatening public safety? His voice was breaking as he asked the question, because these were people he'd worked alongside, people he'd trusted with his life, and now they were part of the group that was hunting down innocent civilians. The helicopter pilot radioed in again with an update that made the scope of our situation clear. He said the groups of infected people throughout Dallas County were no longer moving randomly. They were all converging on downtown Dallas, following major roads and highways in organized columns. From his aerial view, he could see dozens of these columns moving toward the city center like spokes on a wheel. He estimated there were already over 1,000 infected people on the move, and more joining the groups every minute. At 4:45 in the morning, exactly 6 hours after Mrs. Henderson had called about her neighbor eating her dog, I realized that we weren't coordinating emergency response anymore. We were witnessing the collapse of Dallas County in real time, one radio transmission at a time. The infection had spread from isolated food poisoning incidents to a county-wide catastrophe that was overwhelming every system we had in place to handle emergencies. Sarah looked up at me from her console with tears streaming down her face and asked the question that I'd been afraid to voice myself. She asked if we were going to die, if whatever was happening to everyone else was going to happen to us too. If the infected people would eventually make their way to the emergency operations center and turn us into the same kind of monsters we'd been hearing about all night. I didn't have an answer for her, but as I looked at the map on my computer screen, showing the locations of all the active incidents, I could see that the infected groups were indeed moving toward downtown Dallas, toward the government buildings, the police stations, the hospitals, and the emergency services facilities. They were coming for the infrastructure that kept the city running, and that included us. At that moment, Officer Martinez's radio crackled to life one more time. His voice was tight with fear as he reported that the infected group at the diner had detected his presence somehow. They were moving toward his position in organized formation, and he was requesting immediate backup for what he described as multiple attackers at his location. He said they were climbing on top of each other to reach his position, working together like a hive mind, and he wasn't sure his standard equipment would be enough to handle them. Then his radio went silent. Static filled the channel where Martinez's voice had been, and despite repeated attempts to re-establish contact, Unit 47 had gone dark. The last thing we heard from Martinez was him saying that the infected people were somehow getting stronger, more coordinated and more organized as their numbers grew, and that maybe 15 people, all with the same gray skin and white eyes, were about to teach him something about survival that wasn't covered in police academy training. The silence on Martinez's radio channel was deafening. For 15 seconds, maybe 20. The entire operations center went completely quiet except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of sirens wailing throughout Dallas County. Sarah was staring at her console. Mike had stopped typing mid-sentence, and I was holding my radio handset so tightly my knuckles had gone white. We all knew what that silence meant, but none of us wanted to be the first to say it out loud. I tried raising Martinez on the radio every 30 seconds for the next 10 minutes. Unit 47, please respond. Martinez, what's your status? Officer Martinez, please check in with dispatch. Nothing but static. The kind of empty static that fills the space where a human voice used to be. I've heard that static before during my 12 years as a dispatcher, but it never gets easier. Every time an officer goes silent, there's a moment where you have to accept that someone you've been talking to, someone you've been coordinating with, someone whose voice you've gotten used to hearing is probably never going to answer your calls again. But this was different. This wasn't a car accident or a shooting where we could send backup to help a wounded officer. This was something that turned police officers into the same kind of creatures that were terrorizing the rest of Dallas County. Martinez hadn't just been injured or killed. Based on what he'd reported about seeing infected officers at the diner, he'd probably been turned into one of them. The people who were supposed to be protecting Dallas were becoming part of the threat. At 5:23 in the morning, I made the decision to dispatch backup units to Martinez's last known location. Officers Kim and Patterson responded to the diner on Mockingbird Lane, and their radio report confirmed what I'd been afraid to think about. They found Martinez's patrol car in the parking lot with both doors ripped off their hinges. Not damaged in an accident, not broken by tools or weapons, but literally torn off like they'd been made of paper instead of steel. The interior of the car was covered in blood, but there was no body inside. Patterson radioed that they'd found Martinez's radio, his badge, and his service weapons scattered around the parking lot, but no sign of Martinez himself. What they did find were dozens of footprints in the blood around the patrol car. The footprints all showed the same dragging, shuffling gait that witnesses had been describing all night, and leading away from the patrol car was a trail of blood drops that headed directly toward downtown Dallas. Kim requested permission to follow the blood trail, but I denied the request. We couldn't afford to lose any more officers to whatever had happened to Martinez. Instead, I ordered them to establish a perimeter around the diner and observe from a safe distance. What they reported back made everyone in the operations center understand that we were dealing with something that went far beyond normal police work. The diner was full of infected people, but they weren't behaving randomly anymore. They had organized themselves into what Kim described as a military formation. Some were positioned at windows and doors as lookouts. Others were gathered in the center of the building like they were receiving instructions, and a few were moving in coordinated patrols around the exterior of the building. They were exhibiting tactical awareness, strategic thinking, and group coordination that shouldn't have been possible if this was just some kind of biological infection. Even more disturbing was Kim's report about their physical capabilities. She observed one of the infected people lift and throw a heavy metal dumpster, like it weighed nothing. Another one climbed up the side of the building using just his fingernails to find purchase on the brick wall. They were displaying strength and agility that far exceeded normal human limits. The infection wasn't just changing their behavior and appearance. It was enhancing their physical abilities in ways that made them far more dangerous than we'd initially realized. Sarah was monitoring the emergency radio frequencies from other counties and cities throughout Texas. What she reported made me understand that Dallas wasn't an isolated incident. Houston was reporting similar outbreaks near their major food processing facilities. San Antonio had multiple incidents involving aggressive individuals who fit the same description as our infected people. Austin was dealing with what they were calling mass casualty events at grocery stores and restaurants that had received shipments from the same contaminated food distribution network. The infection was spreading throughout Texas following the same pattern we'd seen in Dallas County. Initial outbreaks near food distribution points, rapid spread through direct contact, and infected individuals who displayed enhanced physical capabilities and group coordination. But the reports from other cities included details that we hadn't experienced yet in Dallas: power grid failures, communication blackouts, and what sounded like organized attacks on infrastructure targets. Mike was trying to coordinate with state and federal emergency management agencies, but the responses he was getting didn't match the reality of what we were experiencing. The federal agencies were treating this as a standard biological hazard that could be contained through normal quarantine procedures. They were sending teams with hazmat suits and medical equipment, but they weren't sending the kind of tactical support that would be needed to handle infected individuals with enhanced strength and military-level organization. The most frustrating part was that every agency Mike contacted kept referring to this as an isolated outbreak that would be contained within 24 hours. They had no idea that we were dealing with something that was spreading exponentially and displaying characteristics that weren't covered in any emergency response manual. When Mike tried to explain that infected individuals were immune to standard law enforcement techniques and were displaying supernatural strength, the federal coordinators told him to stick to factual reporting and avoid speculation. At 5:45 in the morning, the helicopter pilot radioed in with an aerial surveillance report that changed everything. He said the groups of infected people that had been moving toward downtown Dallas throughout the night had converged into a massive column that stretched for several city blocks. He estimated there were at least 2,000 infected individuals moving together in organized formation toward the government district where our emergency operations center was located. But the pilot's report included details that made my hands shake as I wrote them down. The infected people weren't just walking toward downtown, they were carrying things: tools, weapons, equipment that they'd scavenged from the areas they'd overrun. They were planning ahead, preparing for whatever they intended to do when they reached their destination. This wasn't mindless wandering. This was a coordinated assault on the infrastructure of Dallas County. Even more terrifying was the pilot's observation about their movement patterns. The infected column wasn't taking the most direct route to downtown. They were following paths that avoided major police and military positions. They were using back roads, service alleys, and routes that would minimize their exposure to organized resistance. They were demonstrating tactical awareness and strategic planning that indicated a level of intelligence that shouldn't have been possible given their apparent condition. Officer Kim radioed from her position near the diner with an update that made everyone in the operations center go silent. She said the infected people inside the building had somehow detected the helicopter overhead. All of them had simultaneously looked up at the sky and begun making coordinated hand signals to each other. Within minutes, several of them had positioned themselves on the roof of the building, with what appeared to be improvised projectile weapons aimed at the aircraft. The helicopter pilot confirmed Kim's report and added that he was observing similar behavior from infected groups throughout Dallas County. They were all responding to his aircraft with coordinated defensive measures. They were communicating with each other across long distances, sharing information about aerial surveillance and taking countermeasures to avoid detection. The infection wasn't just creating mindless zombies. It was creating a coordinated network of enhanced individuals who could think strategically and work together toward common goals. Sarah took a call at 5:50 that made her drop the phone and stare at me with absolute terror in her eyes. The caller was Dr. Rebecca Torres from Presbyterian Hospital, Dallas, and she was calling to report that the hospital had been overrun by infected individuals. But these weren't random attacks by infected people seeking medical attention. According to Dr. Torres, the infected had arrived at the hospital in organized groups with specific objectives. They had systematically taken control of the blood bank, the pharmacy, and the morgue. They weren't destroying these areas or consuming the supplies randomly. They were collecting specific medical supplies and human biological materials with what Dr. Torres described as purposeful intent. The infected people were demonstrating knowledge of hospital operations and medical procedures that suggested they retained specialized expertise from their previous lives. Dr. Torres reported that several of the infected individuals at the hospital were wearing medical scrubs and moving through the facility like they knew exactly where everything was located. When she looked closer, she recognized them as doctors and nurses who had been working at the hospital earlier in the week. They had been infected somehow, but they still retained their medical knowledge and were using it to accomplish objectives that normal infected individuals shouldn't have been capable of understanding. The most disturbing part of Dr. Torres's report was her description of what the infected medical personnel were doing with the supplies they'd collected. They were setting up what appeared to be some kind of medical laboratory in the hospital's research wing. They were handling complex medical equipment with the same expertise they'd possessed before being infected. They were working together on projects that required advanced scientific knowledge. Mike tried to dispatch emergency response teams to the hospital, but Dr. Torres told him not to send anyone. She said the infected people at the hospital weren't just enhanced physically, they were enhanced intellectually as well. They had retained all of their professional knowledge and skills while gaining the physical capabilities and group coordination that we'd observed in other infected individuals. Sending normal emergency responders against infected medical professionals would be sending them to certain death. Officer Patterson radioed from his position near the diner to report that the infected people there had begun moving toward downtown Dallas in formation with the larger column that the helicopter pilot had been tracking. But Patterson's report included a detail that made me realize we were running out of time. He said some of the infected people in the group were wearing police uniforms and carrying law enforcement equipment. They had retained their knowledge of police procedures, radio frequencies, and tactical operations. The infected police officers were using their radios to monitor our emergency communications. They were listening to every transmission we made, tracking our response patterns and coordinating their movements to avoid our personnel. We weren't just dealing with enhanced infected individuals. We were dealing with infected individuals who knew exactly how our emergency response systems worked because they had been part of those systems themselves. Sarah looked up from her console and told me something that made my blood run cold. She said she'd been monitoring the emergency frequencies from other Texas cities, and the situation was deteriorating rapidly everywhere. Houston had gone silent 20 minutes ago. San Antonio was reporting complete loss of communication with emergency services. Austin was requesting immediate federal intervention because their local response capabilities had been overwhelmed. The infection was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, and it was targeting the infrastructure that would be needed to coordinate any kind of organized response. Every emergency services facility, every hospital, every government building was being systematically overrun by infected individuals who retained enough of their previous knowledge to know exactly which targets would be most strategically valuable. At 6 o'clock in the morning, as the sun was beginning to rise over Dallas County, I received a call that made me understand that we were completely on our own. The caller identified himself as Agent Harrison from the Centers for Disease Control, and he was calling to inform me that Dallas County was being placed under federal quarantine effective immediately. No one would be allowed to enter or leave the affected area until the outbreak had been contained. Agent Harrison told me that federal response teams were being deployed to establish a quarantine perimeter around Dallas County, but they would not be entering the affected area until the situation had been assessed from a safe distance. He said that based on reports from other affected cities, standard containment procedures were ineffective against this particular biological agent. The federal government was implementing what he called alternative containment strategies. When I asked Agent Harrison what alternative containment strategies meant, he told me that information was classified and that local emergency services should continue following standard protocols until further notice. But his tone of voice told me everything I needed to know. The federal government had decided that Dallas County was a lost cause. They were going to contain the infection by sealing off the entire area and letting whatever was happening inside run its course. Mike had been monitoring federal emergency communications frequencies, and he pulled me aside to share what he'd been hearing. Military units were being positioned around the perimeter of Dallas County, but they weren't rescue teams or medical support. They were combat units with orders to prevent anyone or anything from leaving the quarantine zone. The federal government wasn't planning to save Dallas. They were planning to sacrifice it to prevent the infection from spreading to other areas. The helicopter pilot radioed in with his final report at 6:15 in the morning. He said the column of infected individuals had reached the outskirts of downtown Dallas and was dividing into smaller groups that were moving toward specific targets. One group was heading toward the police headquarters, another toward the fire department, and a third group was moving directly toward our emergency operations center. He estimated we had less than 30 minutes before they reached our building. But the pilot's final transmission included information that made me realize escape might still be possible. He said there were maintenance tunnels and service corridors beneath downtown Dallas that connected most of the government buildings. If we could reach the tunnel system before the infected people surrounded our building, we might be able to move through the underground network to reach areas that weren't under direct assault. Sarah was crying again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the realization that we were going to have to abandon our post and leave people throughout Dallas County without emergency services coordination. We were going to have to stop taking the calls from people who were trapped, hiding, and desperately needing help. We were going to have to save ourselves instead of doing the job we'd sworn to do. Mike made the announcement that I'd been dreading. He said we had 15 minutes to gather essential supplies and prepare to evacuate the emergency operations center. The infected were closing in on our position. Federal authorities had written off Dallas County, and staying at our posts would accomplish nothing except getting us killed or turned into the same kind of creatures that were destroying the city. I looked at my console one more time, at the map showing dozens of active incidents throughout Dallas County, at the phone lines that were still ringing with calls from people who needed help. In 12 years as a dispatcher, I had never abandoned my post during an emergency. I had never stopped taking calls from people who were counting on me to send help, but I was about to do exactly that, because the alternative was becoming part of the problem instead of part of the solution. At 6:30 in the morning, I made my final radio transmission as a Dallas County emergency dispatcher. I broadcast on all emergency frequencies that the Dallas Emergency Operations Center was being evacuated and that emergency services coordination would be suspended indefinitely. I advised all remaining personnel to abandon their positions and seek individual safety because organized resistance was no longer possible. Then I did something that violated every protocol and regulation I'd been trained to follow. I switched to the general emergency broadcast frequency and transmitted a message directly to the civilian population of Dallas County. I told them that the federal government was implementing a quarantine that would prevent anyone from leaving the area. I told them that the infected individuals retained intelligence and capabilities from their previous lives, making them far more dangerous than typical biological hazards. And I told them that anyone who wanted to survive needed to get out of Dallas immediately, before the military perimeter was fully established. After I finished that transmission, I turned off my console for the last time and followed Mike and Sarah toward the emergency exit that would take us to the maintenance tunnels beneath the building. As we reached the stairwell, I could hear sounds from outside that confirmed the helicopter pilot's final report. Heavy footsteps, multiple voices, making inhuman sounds, and the unmistakable noise of a large group moving with coordinated purpose toward our building. At 6:47 in the morning, exactly 4 hours after Mrs. Henderson's first call about her neighbor, I abandoned my post as a Dallas County emergency dispatcher and began the most terrifying journey of my life through the underground tunnels, beneath a city that was being systematically destroyed by an enemy that used to be human. I had no idea that the next few hours would teach me things about survival, betrayal, and the collapse of civilization that I never wanted to learn. The maintenance tunnels beneath the Dallas Emergency Operations Center were never meant for human evacuation. They were narrow, poorly lit service corridors designed for utility workers and building maintenance, not for 3 terrified dispatchers carrying emergency supplies through a city that was falling apart above our heads. Mike led the way with a flashlight he'd grabbed from the emergency kit. Sarah stayed close behind him and I brought up the rear, listening constantly for sounds that might indicate we were being followed. The first thing that struck me about being underground was how the sounds from the surface became muffled and distorted. We could still hear them, the inhuman vocalizations, the sound of heavy footsteps, the crash of breaking glass and splintering wood, but everything was filtered through tons of concrete and steel. It made the destruction happening above us feel surreal, like we were listening to a movie soundtrack instead of the actual collapse of our city. Mike had worked in the Emergency Operations Center longer than anyone, and he knew about the tunnel system because he'd coordinated maintenance work down here dozens of times over the years. He told us the tunnels connected most of the government buildings in downtown Dallas, including the police headquarters, the fire department, city hall, and the federal courthouse. If we could navigate the system correctly, we might be able to reach one of the buildings on the outskirts of downtown and find a way out of the area before the infected or the military sealed off all escape routes. But as we moved through the tunnels, Mike also explained something that made our situation much more dangerous than I'd initially realized. The tunnel system wasn't just used for building maintenance. It was also used for telecommunications and emergency communications infrastructure. All of the fiber optic cables, emergency radio repeaters, and backup communication systems for Dallas County ran through these same tunnels. If the infected individuals retained their professional knowledge, any of them who had worked in telecommunications or emergency services would know about these tunnels and how to access them. Sarah was holding up better than I'd expected. She'd stopped crying and had focused all of her attention on moving quietly and quickly through the narrow passages. But every few minutes she would grab my arm and whisper questions that I couldn't answer. How many people in Dallas were still alive? How long would it take for the infection to spread to other cities? Was there anywhere in the country that would be safe from whatever was happening here? I didn't have answers for her questions, but based on what we'd heard from other Texas cities during our final hour in the operations center, I was beginning to suspect that Dallas was just the beginning. The infection had spread too quickly and too efficiently to be a natural occurrence. The contaminated food distribution network had been too perfectly positioned to affect multiple major cities simultaneously. This felt like it had been planned, coordinated, designed to achieve maximum impact in minimum time. 20 minutes into our underground journey, we encountered our first sign that the infected people knew about the tunnel system. Mike's flashlight illuminated scratch marks on the tunnel walls that looked fresh, deep gouges in the concrete that could have been made by fingernails or improvised tools. The scratches followed the same path we were taking, heading toward the police headquarters, and they were accompanied by that distinctive smell of decay that witnesses had been reporting all night. We found the first body 30 feet past the scratch marks. It was a city maintenance worker, still wearing his orange safety vest and hard hat, but his throat had been torn open, and his body was positioned in a way that suggested he'd been dragged through the tunnel before being killed. The blood around the body was still wet, which meant this had happened recently. Very recently. Mike whispered that we needed to change direction and head toward the fire department instead of the police headquarters. If the infected people were using the tunnels to move around downtown, they would probably focus on the most important strategic targets first. Police headquarters would be a high priority because it contained weapons, communication equipment, and tactical resources. The fire department might be less heavily defended by infected people, which would give us a better chance of reaching the surface safely. But as we changed direction and moved toward the fire department tunnel branch, we started hearing sounds ahead of us that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps moving through the tunnels with the same coordinated rhythm we'd been hearing from infected groups all night. They were down here with us using the same escape route we'd chosen, and they were between us and our intended destination. Sarah grabbed my arm so tightly I could feel her fingernails digging into my skin. She was terrified that we were trapped, underground with infected people who knew these tunnels better than we did. But Mike had an idea that might save us. He whispered that there were emergency access points throughout the tunnel system, maintenance shafts that led directly to the surface. If we could find one of those shafts in an area that wasn't overrun by infected people, we might be able to get out of the tunnels and reach street level without encountering the groups that were moving through the main passages. We backtracked to an intersection where Mike remembered seeing an emergency access shaft during previous maintenance coordination. The shaft was exactly where he remembered it, a narrow vertical passage with a ladder leading up to a street-level access panel. But when Mike climbed up to check the surface conditions, he came back down with news that made our situation even more desperate. The street above us was full of infected people, but they weren't moving randomly or aimlessly. They were working together to build barricades across major roads and intersections. Using cars, construction materials, and debris, they were systematically blocking every route that could be used for vehicular escape from downtown Dallas. They were demonstrating engineering knowledge and tactical planning that indicated they understood how to trap uninfected people in specific geographic areas. Even more disturbing was Mike's report about what the infected people were carrying. Many of them had weapons. Not just improvised clubs and knives, but actual firearms that they'd taken from police officers, security guards, and gun stores throughout the city. They were handling these weapons with expertise that suggested they retained muscle memory and training from their previous lives. Former police officers, military veterans, and security personnel who had been infected were now using their professional skills to support the infected group's objectives. We were trapped underground with infected people moving through the tunnels, and trapped underground by infected people controlling the surface. Our only option was to keep moving through the tunnel system and hope we could find an access point in an area that wasn't heavily defended. But with every minute that passed, the chances of finding such an area were getting smaller. Sarah whispered something that made me realize how much the situation had deteriorated in just a few hours. She said she could hear explosions in the distance, muffled by the concrete above us but still clearly audible. The explosions were coming from different directions and seemed to be getting closer to our position. Either the infected people were using explosives to destroy infrastructure targets, or the military was beginning their containment operations ahead of schedule. Mike checked his watch and told us something that made my hands start shaking. It was 7:30 in the morning. We'd been underground for almost an hour, but it felt like we'd been down here for days. Time was moving differently when you were running for your life through tunnels beneath a city that was being systematically destroyed by creatures that used to be human beings. We reached another intersection in the tunnel system, and Mike had to make a decision about which direction would give us the best chance of survival. To the left, the tunnel led toward City Hall and the federal courthouse. To the right, it led toward the Dallas County Hospital and the medical district. Straight ahead, it continued toward the fire department, but we could still hear infected people moving through that section. Mike chose the medical district route because he thought the hospital might have emergency evacuation procedures that we could follow. Medical facilities were required to have multiple escape routes and emergency protocols that might help us reach safety. But as we moved toward the hospital tunnel, we started encountering signs that made me wish we'd chosen a different direction. The tunnel leading to the medical district was filled with medical equipment that had been dragged underground. Hospital, beds, surgical instruments, pharmaceutical supplies, and complex diagnostic machines were scattered throughout the passage like someone had been looting the hospital and bringing the stolen materials into the tunnel system. But this wasn't random looting. The equipment was organized, sorted, and arranged in ways that suggested it was being collected for specific purposes. We found the second body near a pile of medical supplies that included blood bags, IV equipment, and surgical tools. This victim was wearing hospital scrubs, and the condition of the body suggested that death had been slow and deliberate, rather than quick and merciful. Someone or something had taken time to inflict injuries that would have required medical knowledge to execute. The infected people weren't just killing randomly. They were using professional expertise to accomplish objectives that normal people couldn't understand. Sarah was starting to hyperventilate, and Mike had to stop moving to help her calm down. The combination of being trapped underground, seeing evidence of systematic killing, and knowing that infected people with medical training were operating in our area was more psychological pressure than anyone should have to handle. But we couldn't afford to stop for long. Every minute we spent stationary was another minute for infected people to track our location and cut off our escape routes. When we reached the tunnel section directly beneath Dallas County Hospital, we could hear sounds from above that indicated the medical facility had been completely overrun. Heavy machinery operating, power tools cutting through building materials, and what sounded like construction work on a massive scale. The infected people weren't just occupying the hospital. They were modifying it, expanding it, turning it into something that served their purposes instead of its original medical mission. Mike found an emergency access shaft that led directly into the hospital basement, and despite our fears about what we might encounter, he decided to investigate the surface conditions. We needed to know what the infected people were doing up there, and we needed to assess whether the hospital could provide us with a safe route out of the downtown area. When Mike climbed the shaft and opened the access panel, the sounds that filtered down to where Sarah and I were waiting made us both understand that the infected people were far more dangerous than we'd initially realized. We could hear human voices, but they were speaking in coordinated patterns that sounded almost like military communications. Commands being given, reports being received, status updates being shared between different groups working on different projects. Mike came back down the shaft with information that changed everything I thought I knew about the infection. He said the hospital had been converted into what looked like a research and development facility. The infected people were conducting experiments using the medical equipment they'd collected, and they were doing it with the same level of expertise and organization that you'd expect from trained medical professionals. But the most terrifying part of Mike's report was his description of what he'd seen in the hospital laboratories. The infected people were working with biological samples, blood, tissue, and other materials that suggested they were trying to understand and improve the infection itself. They weren't just spreading the infection randomly. They were studying it, modifying it, and developing ways to make it more effective at achieving whatever their ultimate objectives were. Mike also reported seeing infected people who were clearly in leadership positions, giving orders to other infected individuals, and coordinating complex activities that required advanced planning and communication skills. The infection wasn't creating mindless zombies. It was creating an organized society with hierarchies, specializations, and collective goals that went far beyond simple survival. We had to keep moving, but Mike's reconnaissance had given us crucial information about the scope of what we were facing. This wasn't a biological accident or a natural disease outbreak. This was an organized transformation of human society, carried out by infected individuals who retained their intelligence and professional skills while gaining enhanced physical capabilities and complete devotion to collective objectives. Sarah asked the question that I'd been afraid to think about. She wanted to know if there was any chance that uninfected humans could coexist with the infected people, or if this was a zero-sum situation where one group would have to completely eliminate the other. Based on what we'd observed throughout the night, I was beginning to suspect that coexistence wasn't an option. The infected people were systematically eliminating uninfected humans and converting infrastructure to serve their own purposes. This was conquest, not cohabitation. As we continued moving through the tunnel system, heading away from the hospital and toward what we hoped would be a less heavily defended area, we started hearing new sounds that indicated the situation above. Ground was escalating rapidly. Helicopter rotors, heavy vehicle engines, and what sounded like coordinated military operations. The federal containment forces were moving into position around Dallas County, and they were bringing serious firepower to establish their quarantine perimeter. But we also heard explosions that were definitely coming from inside the quarantine zone, not from the military forces outside it. The infected people were destroying infrastructure targets throughout Dallas, systematically eliminating the systems that would be needed for any kind of organized resistance or rescue operation. They were cutting power lines, destroying communication towers, and sabotaging transportation networks to ensure that uninfected humans couldn't coordinate effective opposition. Mike checked his watch again and told us we'd been underground for almost 2 hours. The sun was fully up now, and the infected people would have had time to establish complete control over downtown Dallas. Our chances of reaching the surface safely were getting smaller with every minute that passed, but staying underground indefinitely wasn't an option either. The tunnel system had limited air circulation, no food or water supplies, and infected people who knew how to access it. We reached another emergency access shaft, and Mike decided to check surface conditions one more time before we committed to a specific escape route. This shaft led to a street corner about 6 blocks from the Emergency Operations Center, in an area that was primarily residential rather than government or commercial buildings. Mike hoped that residential areas might be less strategically important to the infected people and therefore less heavily defended. When Mike opened the access panel and looked out at street level, he came back down with news that made me understand just how completely Dallas had fallen. The residential neighborhood above us was empty, but not because people had evacuated. It was empty because every house, every apartment building, every structure that could have sheltered uninfected people had been systematically destroyed. The infected people had conducted a block-by-block search and destroy operation to eliminate any place where uninfected humans might hide or organize resistance. But Mike also saw something that gave us a small ray of hope. In the distance, beyond the destroyed residential area, he could see the interstate highway that led out of Dallas toward the east. There were military vehicles positioned along the highway, establishing the federal quarantine perimeter, but the road itself was still intact. If we could reach the interstate and get past the military checkpoints, we might be able to escape Dallas County before the quarantine was complete. The problem was that reaching the interstate would require us to cross about 2 miles of urban area that was now controlled by infected people. We would have to move on foot through territory where we had no cover, no support, and no way to defend ourselves against enhanced individuals who could coordinate their actions and use professional knowledge to hunt us down. Sarah looked at me and Mike and said something that made me realize how much we'd all changed in just a few hours. She said she'd rather die trying to escape than die hiding in the tunnels, waiting for the infected people to find us. The young woman who had been crying with fear earlier in the night had transformed into someone who was ready to take desperate risks for the chance of survival. Mike agreed with Sarah's assessment. We couldn't stay underground much longer, and we couldn't wait for rescue that wasn't coming. Our only option was to try reaching the interstate before the military perimeter was fully established, and before the infected people had time to set up defensive positions along all the escape routes. At 8:47 in the morning, exactly 6 hours after Mrs. Henderson's first call about her neighbor, I made the decision that would either save our lives or get us killed. We were going to leave the relative safety of the tunnel system and attempt to cross 2 miles of infected territory to reach the interstate highway. I had no idea that the next hour would teach me things about courage, sacrifice, and the true cost of survival that would haunt me for the rest of my life. We emerged from the tunnel system into a Dallas that no longer existed. The residential neighborhood that Mike had observed from the access shaft looked even worse at ground level than it had from below. Every house had been systematically destroyed, not by explosions or fire, but by methodical demolition that left nothing standing higher than a few feet. The infected people had taken apart an entire neighborhood piece by piece, ensuring that no structure could provide shelter or defensive positions for uninfected survivors. The smell hit us immediately. Death, decay, and something else that I couldn't identify but that made every instinct in my body scream that we needed to get away from this place as quickly as possible. Sarah covered her nose and mouth with her sleeve, but the smell was so pervasive that it seemed to seep through any barrier we tried to create. This wasn't just the smell of bodies that had been left in the sun. This was the smell of something that was actively decomposing while still being alive. Mike pointed toward the interstate highway that was visible in the distance, about 2 miles east of our position. We could see military vehicles positioned along the road, and we could hear helicopter rotors indicating that federal forces were establishing their quarantine perimeter. But between us and the highway was an urban wasteland that would provide no cover and no protection if we were discovered by infected people during our crossing attempt. The first challenge was immediate. We needed to move across open ground without being detected, but we also needed to move quickly because staying exposed for extended periods would guarantee discovery. Mike suggested that we follow the drainage ditches and utility corridors that ran parallel to the major streets. These paths would provide some concealment while still allowing us to make progress toward the interstate. As we started moving through the destroyed neighborhood, I began to understand the scope of what the infected people had accomplished in just a few hours. This wasn't random destruction. Every building had been taken apart in ways that salvaged useful materials while eliminating defensive positions. Metal, concrete, electrical components, and other resources had been sorted and stacked in organized piles throughout the area. The infected people were conducting urban mining operations to collect materials for construction projects somewhere else. Sarah pointed out something that made me realize how much danger we were still in. She said the organized piles of materials were too neat, too recent, which meant infected people were still working in this area. We weren't crossing through abandoned territory. We were crossing through an active work zone where infected people could return at any time to continue their demolition and salvage operations. We'd been moving for about 20 minutes when we encountered our first infected person since leaving the tunnels. He was standing motionless next to one of the material piles, and at first I thought he might be dead. But as we got closer, I could see that he was breathing, and his head would occasionally turn to scan the surrounding area, like he was maintaining watch over the salvage operation. The infected person was wearing the uniform of a construction worker, complete with hard hat and tool belt. But his skin had the same gray pallor we'd been hearing about all night, and his eyes had gone completely white. When he turned in our direction, I could see that his face retained enough human features to be recognizable as someone who had once been a normal person. But there was something fundamentally different about his expression that made him appear more like a machine than a human being. Mike motioned for us to stop moving and remain completely still. The infected person continued his scanning pattern for several minutes, turning his head in precise increments to cover specific sections of the area around the material pile. His movements were too regular, too systematic to be natural human behavior. He was following a programmed surveillance routine that had been optimized for maximum coverage with minimum energy expenditure. After what felt like an eternity, the infected person turned away from our position and walked toward another area of the neighborhood where we could see more material piles and signs of ongoing demolition work. His walking pattern was the same, jerky, unnatural gait that witnesses had been describing, but he moved with purpose and direction that indicated he knew exactly where he was going and what he intended to do when he got there. We waited until he was completely out of sight before continuing our movement toward the interstate. But the encounter had taught us something important about infected behavior that would affect our escape strategy. They were organized, but they were also predictable. If we could understand their patrol patterns and work schedules, we might be able to time our movements to avoid detection while still making progress toward our destination. The next mile of our journey took us through what had been a commercial district with strip malls, gas stations, and restaurants. Like the residential area, everything had been systematically demolished, But here we could see evidence of more sophisticated operations. The infected people had established what appeared to be processing centers, where materials from the demolished buildings were being sorted, modified, and prepared for transportation to other locations. Sarah noticed something that made our situation even more dangerous than we'd realized. She pointed out that the processing centers were connected by freshly constructed roads that hadn't existed before the outbreak. The infected people weren't just demolishing existing infrastructure, they were building new infrastructure to support whatever objectives they were trying to accomplish. They had engineering capabilities, construction equipment, and coordinated labor forces that were reshaping the physical landscape of Dallas County. But the most disturbing aspect of the processing centers was the evidence of human involvement in their construction. We could see clothing, personal belongings, and other items that had clearly come from uninfected people scattered around the work areas. The infected people weren't just eliminating uninfected humans. They were using them as resources for their construction projects in ways that I didn't want to think about too carefully. We were about halfway to the interstate when we encountered something that forced us to completely change our escape route. Mike spotted a group of infected people moving along the same drainage ditch we'd been using for concealment. They were heading directly toward our position, and they were moving faster than we could retreat or advance without being detected. The group consisted of about 15 infected people, and they were clearly conducting a systematic search of the area. Some were checking the drainage ditches, while others were examining the demolished buildings and material piles. They were communicating with each other through gestures and sounds that indicated they were looking for something specific. Based on their search pattern, I was afraid they might be looking for us. We had to leave the drainage ditch and find a different route to the interstate, but the open ground between us and alternative concealment offered almost no cover. Mike made the decision to try reaching a partially demolished gas station about 200 yards from our position. If we could get inside the building without being seen, we might be able to wait for the search party to move past us before continuing toward the highway. The sprint to the gas station was the most terrifying. 2 minutes of my life. We had to cross completely, open ground while staying low enough to avoid detection, but moving fast enough to reach cover before the search party spotted us. Every step felt like it was taking forever, and every second felt like someone was about to shout an alarm that would bring dozens of infected people running toward our position. We made it to the gas station without being detected, but once we were inside the partially demolished building, we discovered that our hiding place was more dangerous than the open ground we just crossed. The building was full of evidence that infected people had been using it as a temporary shelter and planning center. Maps of Dallas County covered the walls, marked with symbols and notations that indicated strategic targets, resource locations, and operational timelines. The maps showed that the infected people had divided Dallas County into sectors, each with specific objectives and completion deadlines. Some sectors were marked as fully converted, others were designated for demolition, and a few were labeled with symbols that I couldn't interpret but that made me nervous about what they might represent. The infection wasn't spreading randomly. It was following a detailed plan that had been developed with strategic thinking and long-term objectives. Sarah found a pile of documents that made our situation even more desperate. They were evacuation plans, emergency protocols, and response procedures that had been taken from government buildings and emergency services facilities throughout Dallas County. The infected people had captured all of the information they needed to predict and counter any organized resistance or rescue attempts. They knew every escape route, every safe house, and every emergency procedure that uninfected people might try to use. But the most chilling discovery was a timeline posted on one of the walls that showed the infection spreading to other cities throughout Texas, and then to other states across the country. According to the timeline, Dallas was just the first phase of a nationwide operation that would systematically convert every major metropolitan area within 30 days. The contaminated food distribution network had been the initial vector, but the infection was now spreading through coordinated infiltration, operations that were being directed from converted cities like Dallas. Mike checked his watch and told us we'd been hiding in the gas station for almost an hour. We needed to keep moving toward the interstate, but we also needed to avoid the search parties that were now operating throughout the area. The infected People had increased their security operations, probably because they knew that some uninfected people had escaped the initial conversion phase and were trying to reach the quarantine perimeter. We left the gas station and continued toward the interstate using a route that took us through an industrial area where the demolition operations were less complete. The larger buildings and more complex infrastructure had slowed down the infected people's systematic destruction, which provided us with more cover and concealment options. But it also meant that we were more likely to encounter active work crews that were still conducting demolition and salvage operations. The industrial area showed us the true scope of the infected people's capabilities. They had taken apart manufacturing facilities, warehouses, and distribution centers with precision that preserved valuable equipment while eliminating defensive positions. Heavy machinery, electronics, and specialized tools had been collected and organized for transportation to other locations. The infected people weren't just destroying infrastructure, they were relocating it to support their operations in other cities. We were less than half a mile from the interstate when we encountered the largest group of infected people we'd seen since leaving the tunnels. They were loading equipment and materials onto a convoy of trucks that stretched for several city blocks. The convoy was clearly preparing to leave Dallas and transport resources to wherever the infected people were establishing their next operational center. But what made this convoy especially dangerous for us was that it was positioned directly between our location and the interstate highway. We couldn't reach the quarantine perimeter without passing through an area that was full of infected people who were conducting active loading operations. Any attempt to cross their operational zone would result in immediate detection and capture. Mike suggested that we wait for the convoy to finish loading and depart before attempting to reach the interstate. But Sarah pointed out something that made waiting impossible. She could hear additional vehicles approaching from multiple directions, and the sound patterns indicated that more convoys were converging on this location. Rather than waiting for one group to leave, we would soon be surrounded by multiple groups that would make escape impossible. Our only option was to try circling around the convoy operation and approaching the interstate from a different direction. This would add significant distance to our journey and take us through areas where we had no information about infected people's activities, but it was better than trying to fight our way through an active operational zone. The detour took us through a section of Dallas County that had been completely abandoned by both infected and uninfected people. The buildings were intact, the streets were empty, and there were no signs of the systematic demolition we'd seen elsewhere. At first, this seemed like good news because it meant we could move more quickly without worrying about detection. But as we got deeper into the abandoned area, I started to understand why even the infected people were avoiding this section. The silence was wrong. Not just quiet, but completely devoid of any sounds that would indicate life or activity. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the buildings, no distant traffic or machinery. The infected people made sounds when they moved and worked, but this area was so quiet that it felt like we were walking through a vacuum. Something had happened here that made even enhanced, coordinated, intelligent, infected people decide it was too dangerous to enter. Sarah was the first to notice the smell that explained why this area was abandoned. It wasn't the smell of decay or death that we'd encountered elsewhere. It was a chemical smell, sharp and acrid, that burned our throats and made our eyes water. Someone had used chemical weapons in this area, probably as an attempt to stop the infected people. But the chemicals had made the entire zone uninhabitable for any form of life. We had to move through the contaminated zone as quickly as possible to minimize our exposure to whatever chemicals were still present in the air and on the surfaces around us. But we also had to be careful not to make noise that might attract attention from infected people in the surrounding areas. The chemical zone provided concealment, but it also trapped us in an area where we couldn't call for help and couldn't defend ourselves if we were discovered. The interstate highway was finally visible when we reached the far edge of the chemical zone. We could see military vehicles, soldiers, and the barriers that marked the federal quarantine perimeter. But we could also see that the military was not allowing anyone to approach the perimeter from inside the quarantine zone. Soldiers were positioned with weapons aimed toward Dallas County, ready to prevent anyone or anything from leaving the infected area. Mike realized that reaching the quarantine perimeter would not guarantee our safety. The federal forces were operating under orders to contain the infection by any means necessary, which probably included shooting uninfected people who tried to escape the quarantine zone. We would have to convince the soldiers that we were not infected, that we had valuable information about the situation inside Dallas County, and that we posed no threat to the containment operation. We approached the perimeter slowly, with our hands visible and our voices raised to identify ourselves as emergency services personnel. The soldiers were clearly nervous about any contact with people from inside the quarantine zone, but our knowledge of emergency protocols and our ability to provide detailed information about the infected people's capabilities eventually convinced them that we were legitimate refugees rather than infected infiltrators. The decontamination process took several hours and involved medical examinations, blood tests, and extensive debriefing sessions with federal agents who wanted to know everything we'd observed about the infected people's organization, capabilities, and objectives. But the most disturbing part of the debriefing was learning that Dallas wasn't an isolated incident. Similar outbreaks were being reported in Houston, San Antonio, Austin, and 6 other major cities throughout Texas. The federal agents told us that the contaminated food distribution network had been more extensive than anyone initially realized. Processing facilities in multiple states had been compromised, and infected products had been distributed to metropolitan areas throughout the South and Southwest. The infection was spreading exactly according to the timeline we'd found in the gas station, and federal authorities were struggling to implement containment measures quickly enough to prevent nationwide catastrophe. But what made our situation hopeless was the agent's admission that standard containment procedures were ineffective against this particular biological agent. The infected people retained too much intelligence and coordination to be stopped by conventional quarantine measures. They were adapting to countermeasures faster than authorities could implement new strategies, and they were using captured information to predict and neutralize any organized resistance. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, less than 24 hours after Mrs. Henderson's first call about her neighbor, I watched from the federal command post as military aircraft began bombing Dallas County. The government had decided that the only way to prevent the infection from spreading was to destroy everything inside the quarantine zone, including any uninfected people who might still be hiding in the city. I still monitor emergency frequencies from the command post where federal authorities relocated me after the Dallas evacuation. The infection has now spread to over 30 cities across the United States, and the pattern is always the same. Initial food contamination, rapid spread through direct contact, systematic conversion of infrastructure, and organized expansion to new territories. The infected people are winning because they're not just spreading an infection. They're implementing a plan that was designed by intelligence that understands human society better than we understand it ourselves. The worst part about my survival isn't the guilt of leaving people behind or the horror of watching civilization collapse. The worst part is that I'm still getting calls on the emergency frequencies. Calls from inside the quarantine zones from people who are trapped in cities that have been overrun by infected populations. But the voices on those calls aren't asking for rescue anymore. They're asking for forgiveness from the human race because they're about to stop being human themselves. And they want someone to remember what they used to be before the infection takes that away from them forever.